In today's video, we're going to go over some of the best Azerite traits during the Battle for Azeroth expansion, with the main focus being on class-specific traits instead of the generic ones. But there is a generic trait on this list, and it was super powerful. As a note, this list does not include any corruption traits, and we'll be listing any of that throughout the video. Starting us off at number 10, we have Test of Might. This is an Azerite trait for Arms Warriors that made it so whenever the warrior had Colossus Smash and Warbreaker expire, they gained increased strength for every 10 rage they spent during it, and had the buff last for 12 seconds. The reason why this is so powerful is because of how Arms Warriors play. You see, the Arms Warriors damage came from Colossus Smash windows. You generate rage, use Colossus Smash, then dump rage into that small window. With the warrior not really doing damage outside that window, it was far more beneficial for them to wait for Colossus Smash to come off cooldown, then rinse and repeat. This trait kind of offset that a tiny bit, as the increase of strength afterwards allowed them to be able to do some actual good damage outside of Colossus Smash windows, instead of having to wait for Colossus Smash to come off cooldown to be able to do damage again. Especially since the rage cost of abilities was at the 10 mark, the warrior would be able to, in theory, generate a ton of strength during this time frame and have a strong, constant damage output, even outside of the Colossus Smash window. This talent was so good that it beat their next best trait, Crushing Assault, by a mile, even if Crushing Assault was stacked 3 times. As the warrior got so much use from this trait, they only needed a single trait. But if the warrior did decide to stack it, which wasn't necessary as they had other good traits to choose from, it would add more strength to their overall bonus, making it one of the best traits in the game for Arms Warriors. The reason why this is last on this list is because while it was very strong for Arms Warriors, the power this trait gave wasn't anywhere near the consistency or burst damage that the rest of the traits on this list have. However, Test of Might was, and still is, a strong trait regardless. And at number 9, we have Furious Gaze. This was an Azerite trait for Demon Hunters that allowed them to get a very good amount of haste after fully channeling their Eye Beam ability. The reason why this was so good was because haste for Demon Hunters and all melee classes makes them auto-attack much faster. And with Demon Blades being their best talent, which makes their auto-attacks have a 60% chance to deal extra damage and generate fury and replace Demon Bites, having faster auto-attack speed meant they could do more damage with this talent taken, while also freeing up their GCD because they no longer had to use Demon's Bite. The amount of haste granted also decreased the cooldown of one of their other main abilities, Blade Dance, which was also used in both AoE and single target as a main part of the rotation when combined with some of their other Azerite traits and talents. If the Demon Hunter decided to stack Furious Gaze, it was possible to have all of the haste bonuses stack with each other and get an absurd amount of haste with the channel finished. And with Eye Beam being a main part of the Demon Hunter's DPS rotation too, this meant that the haste buff would basically have 100% uptime. Combined with the Blind Fury talent that can get a nice damage boost in Eye Beams as well as the insane buff after, making this trait a really good and top tier pick for Havoc players. Now, the reason why this trait makes it on this spot is because, while extremely strong, Demon Hunters aren't really known for their single target damage, as Havoc is really designed around AoE. It did do some good damage on single target, however, but Demon Hunters did have another trait that was better for single target if stacked, like Champion of Azeroth. But this talent is still very fun and strong to use and definitely deserves a mention on this list. And at number 8, we have Light's Decree. This is a trait for Retribution Paladins that causes them to explode in Holy Light that does a certain amount of damage per holy power spent to all nearby enemies and increases the duration of Avenging Wrath and Crusade by 5 seconds. Now, unlike many other talents that needed to be stacked to gain its full benefit, Light's Decree only needed one single trait in order to do insane amounts of damage. See, Retribution Paladins are a very burst heavy spec, and they aren't known for having strong damage outside of the burst window, being Avenging Wrath. And anything that benefits the damage that a Ret Paladin can do during Avenging Wrath just makes them that much better. Since Light's Decree worked only during the burst, this significantly increased the amount of damage they did for single target, but especially in AoE situations. If a Ret Paladin did decide to stack it, the duration didn't increase, but the amount of damage that happened when Holy Power was spent did. However, this was actually worse as Ret had other good traits to focus on, so keeping Light's Decree at a single stack was the best option for them. Light's Decree also worked off their Mastery too, and the higher the Mastery, which was able to get obscenely high near the end of the expansion through corruptions and such, made them do just so much more damage during Avenging Wrath, making this one of their best choices that a Ret Paladin could have. While Light's Decree was insanely strong for Ret Paladins, they did have another trait called Avenger's Might that was better for them and was actually used in the other slots too. For single target situations, Avenger's Might did pull ahead, but ever so slightly. And Light's Decree not only looked awesome, but it was also doing a ton of damage, and even made it into a miniature talent called Sanctified Wrath in the Shadowlands too. At number 7, we have Streaking Stars. This was a trait for Bounce Druids that had a pretty unique effect as it was very similar to a Windwalker Monk's Mastery. See, during a Bounce Druid's main DPS cooldown, Celestial Alignment, which increased their haste by 10% for 20 seconds, if the Druid weaved their abilities in a sense, like how a Windwalker Monk does, they would gain a pretty nice damage bonus thanks to Streaking Star, and this applied to each ability used that wasn't a repeat of the previous one. So for example, if a druid used Star Surge and then Wrath right after, Wrath would get a really huge damage boost. But if the druid used Wrath twice in a row, it would not get a damage boost. This not only made the playstyle very fun and interesting for balanced druids, but it also gave them a substantial damage buff if they had this trait stacked and pulled off the rotation correctly, as the damage buff would get insanely high and have their abilities hit like a truck every time while making them do damage faster because of the 10% increase to their haste. If the druid decided they wanted to be stacking this trait, it did more damage than every other trait the balanced druid could choose from, making it required to stay competitive, and an insane damage boost even if the druid had just reached level cap. It wasn't uncommon to see a balanced druid use their cooldowns and immediately skyrocket to the top of the DPS meters. While balanced druids were a very strong pick throughout Battle for Azeroth, in AoE situations they did have a better trait called High Noon, which was far better than Streaking Stars was. But this trait is a very fun trait that required the balanced druid to play outside the normal playstyle, and rewarded them for doing so by giving them a large increase in damage, which added that much more skill to an already satisfying to play class. And at number 6 we have Blaster Master. This was a trait for fire mages that increased their mastery by a certain amount for 3 seconds whenever they would use Fire Blast. And since fire mages would often use Fire Blast to get their second critical hit, since Fire Blast had a 100% chance to crit, it would increase their mastery by quite a substantial amount, and also stacked if they had more than one of these traits or had the talent Flame On, which gave them another charge of Fire Blast and reduce its cooldown. The 3-second timer provided by the buff was just enough for them to use their Fire Blast for single target or Flame Strike for AoE, as the increase of mastery provided this buff would increase the amount of damage their Ignite did, and let them have an insane amount of damage because of it, due to the nasty dot that we left behind on the target. This trait was actually so strong that for AoE it was basically required, as the second best option, Clockwork Heart, was a 10k DPS difference. And for single target, Blaster Master still reigned king as being the overall best Azerite trait that fire mages could have at the time compared to everything else they had available. However, to get the full benefit out of this trait, they had to use their burst setup correctly with Ruin of Power, Combustion, Potions, and all that kind of stuff. It was very easy for a fire mage to mess up the rotation, especially if they were new, and the 3-second timer provided was perfect to get that damage in, but if done incorrectly, it would either be wasted or not fully capitalized on. But it still deserves being this high in this list from just how strong the talent really is. And at number 5, we have Explosive Potential. This was a trait for Demonology Warlocks that increased their haste for 15 seconds whenever they would sacrifice 3 or more imps. See, Demonology Warlocks have an ability called Implosion, which causes all the imps the Warlock summon to go fly to the target and explode for a good amount of single target and AoE damage, with Explosive Potential granting a really nice haste buff to Warlocks after using this ability, and the stacking if they had more than one of these traits active, meaning they can get to insanely high haste numbers, similar to Demon Hunter's Furious Gaze, and do crazy dumb amounts of damage because of it. And since haste is their main stat priority outside of intellect, this only gave pure benefits to their already existing playstyle, as they really didn't have to do much outside the normal rotation to keep the buff active since it had such a long duration. In fact, this trait was so good that it was also better than any other option they could have, very similar to many other traits during this time. Similar to the previous spawn on this list, mess up the rotation for Demonology Warlocks was very easy to do, as admittedly, this is quite a confusing spec for a lot of players, and using Implosion at the perfect time to keep the buff active was very difficult as most players, especially new ones, just kind of used it whenever they could and didn't really understand how it worked. But Explosive Potential definitely deserves to be behind this list due to the sheer amount of damage that Demonology Warlocks get from the buff, as haste not only made them attack faster, but also caused their demons to attack faster too. And fast haste usually smooths out all the bumps that a spec may have. And at number 4, we have Icy Citadel. This was a trait available to Frost Death Knights, which increased their strength by a set amount for 6 seconds once their Pillar of Frost expired, and the duration would be increased depending on how many critical strikes they got with Obliterate and Frost Scythe during the duration. Similar to the Arms Warrior test for might, this ability granted the Frost Death Knights some very good damage outside of their cooldowns, which a lot of melee classes had trouble doing since they were more burst focused. With Critical Strike being a very important stat for Frost Death Knights to focus on during this time, this trait synergized well and also stacked. This meant that if the Frost Death Knight had more than one of these traits active at once, the amount of strength would also get increased by a ton as well, as Pillar of Frost having a very short cooldown of only 1 minute, and would be reduced down even further if the Frost Death Knight took the Ice Cap talent. If the Frost Death Knight got very lucky with RNG and scored a bunch of critical hits, it was possible to not actually have this buff expire due to how Ice Cap worked, the increased duration of the buff thanks to crits, and the already low cooldown of Pillar of Frost. While Unholy Death Knights at the time also had a very strong spec with Magus of the Dead for single target damage, and was actually so good that it almost beat Unholy's best AoE trait Festermite too, with Icy Citadel being a fantastic choice for both situations, whereas Unholy needed to switch theirs around depending on what they were going to be going up against. And with the far simpler playstyle the Frost Death Knight offered compared to the Unholy version, this trait gave Frost Death Knights a ton of strength bonus while also making them not do anything outside their rotation to get it. It made Frost Death Knights a strong spec to play because of it. And at number 3, we have Flash Freeze. This is a trait available to Frost Mages that had each of their icicles do more damage and have a chance per icicle to proc Fingers of Frost. Now, this talent doesn't sound all that great on paper, but in gameplay this trait was an absolute monster. See, because each icicle had their own individual chance to proc Fingers of Frost, if the Frost Mage had their talent Glacial Spike, that actually counted as 5 icicles in one, meaning that whenever they would use Glacial Spike, or just shoot out 5 icicles, which is a basic part of the rotation anyways, they would oftentimes get 2 Finger of Frost procs at once. And since this trait could stack, it would increase the damage that all those icicles or Glacial Spike did to the target by an insane amount. As if the Frost Mage had all 3 of these traits active, their Glacial Spikes would do roughly 1300 more damage, and since the playstyle of the Frost Mage was to shatter their spikes, this often led to a critical strike which did 2600 more damage than normal. In terms of numbers based on the time period, this meant a single Glacial Spike could hit for roughly 70% of an average player's HP in one hit. This not only gave Frost Mages a huge damage increase, but it was also one of the best single target traits that they could have, and any spec had. Now, Flash Freeze makes it so high in the class traits because it was not only the best single target damage increase in the game if it procced, but it was also one of the strongest AoE damage increases in the game as well. This trait was so good that wearing a really low item level piece of gear just to have it was worthwhile, as the loss of your main stat was worth the trade-off for the insane damage that came from this trait alone in all situations. And also similar to the Frost Death Knight in regards to not having to change their playstyle to get the damage buff provided. And at number 2 on this list, we have Overwhelming Power. Now, this isn't a class-specific trait, as any class could obtain this, and this trait was one of the most overpowered ones in the game due to a bug. See, Overwhelming Power had a chance to increase your haste by a set amount, which stacked up to 25 times, and the stacks were lost either every second or whenever you took any damage. However, the bug with this trait was that it actually scaled with the player's haste normally and would proc more often if they had higher amounts of it. This meant that you could reach the 25 stack limit very quickly, so much so in fact that any gear that did not have Overwhelming Power on it was seen as worse than a piece that did, even if it was far lower in item level simply due to this bug and this bug alone. And this was so good in fact that nearly every single spec in the game had this as their best in slot secondary trait by far, with Blizzard not even acknowledging how overpowered it was until later on in patch 8.3, where it was finally fixed to no longer trigger more often based on haste rating. Even still, this nerf didn't affect it too much as it was a top tier off trait even to the end of the expansion. The reason why this makes the second spot is because, as mentioned, any class can have this on their gear. And since a lot of specs at the time, and even still now, benefit from huge haste increases in some way, imagine a balanced druid with their Searing Stars and this talent. Or even a Ret Paladin's Light Decree, for example, with this talent too. It buffed every single spec and Azerite trait in the game, all due to a bug. And it's only fair to rank it quite high, as it did so much for everyone regardless of what situation they were in or what class they were playing. And finally, at number 1, we have Glimmer of Light. This is a trait available to Holy Paladins which causes Holy Shock to leave a glimmer of light on the target for 30 seconds. When the Paladin would use Holy Shock, all targets that had this Glimmer of Light effect on them were either damaged or healed for a certain amount. Not only was this talent very strong when stacked together, but it gave Holy Paladins insane and consistent healing potential with good damage when healing wasn't needed, along with a much faster playstyle than their traditional hard caster that they were before, as using this kind of build was centered around melee combat and generating as much holy power as possible using their Holy Shocks along with Crusader Strike, thanks to their talent Crusader's Might, which caused Holy Shock's cooldown to be reduced whenever Crusader Strike was used. This build also used retribution traits, specifically Light's Decree, which as mentioned previously does a burst of holy damage per holy power spent and increases the duration of Avenging Wrath by 5 seconds. If the Holy Paladin had Radiant Incandescence too, their Holy Shock's critical strikes would do even more damage or healed for even more, which is obviously a straight benefit seeing as the entire build quite literally revolves around using Holy Shock as much as possible. So much so that this build was nicknamed Shockadin by the community. And since Holy Shock could be used while moving, since it's an instant cast ability, the Holy Paladin being able to constantly move out of mechanics while healing and dealing damage is very powerful in of itself, as very few other healing specs were able to do this, especially with the amount that the Holy Paladins could do at the time thanks to this trait. It was actually so strong in fact that Blizzard nerfed this playstyle in patch 8.3 and said that it even outperformed high-end content, and changed the ability to be capped at 8 targets and its healing reduced by 12%. Even after the nerfs, it was still a very strong playstyle to use, but admittedly not as powerful as it once was. And still seeing Holy Paladins, whether in PvP, Raid, or Mythic Plus Dungeon, using this even after. Now, the reason this trait is number 1 on this list is because it literally changed how Holy Paladins played the game. So much so, it was made into a regular talent in Shadowlands after BFA, and is a final tier talent for the Holy Tree in Dragonflight as well. Alright, and that's it for the video. If you think we may have missed any other really powerful Azerite traits, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.